My family said I was too quiet at the gathering, so I stood up and said what everyone else was thinking. I'm 26, and 3 weeks ago at my cousin's wedding reception, my family finally pushed me too far with their constant comments about my personality. After years of being called too quiet and antisocial, I stood up in front of everyone and called out the toxic dynamics that have been poisoning our family gatherings for decades. What happened next changed everything. My name is Nathan, and this is about how I learned that sometimes being the quiet one means you're the only person actually paying attention. Let me paint you a picture of my family because understanding these dynamics is crucial to what happened. I'm the youngest of 4 siblings in what most people would call a loud family. My parents, Robert and Linda, have always prided themselves on raising outgoing, successful children who know how to work a room and make an impression. My older siblings, Kevin, Melissa, and Patricia, all inherited this gene for commanding attention and dominating conversations. Then there's me, the quiet one, the observer, the one who sits back and listens while everyone else fights to be heard. Growing up, this personality difference was treated like a character flaw that needed constant fixing. My parents would push me to speak up more at family dinners, forcing me to tell stories or share opinions when all I wanted was to enjoy my food and listen to the natural flow of conversation around me. When relatives would visit, Mom would inevitably introduce me with some variation of "Nathan's our shy one, but he's very smart when you get him talking," as if my natural personality was something that required an apology or explanation. The message was crystal clear from an early age. My authentic self was somehow deficient, something to be overcome rather than accepted. This pattern continued and actually intensified as I moved into adulthood. Every family gathering became an exhausting exercise in managing everyone else's discomfort with my quietness. I'd arrive at events knowing with absolute certainty that someone would inevitably comment on how I'd never talk anymore or ask if everything was okay because I wasn't contributing enough to the chaos that passed for meaningful conversation in my family. The thing is, I wasn't unhappy, depressed, or antisocial in any way. I had close friends who genuinely appreciated my thoughtful nature and my ability to listen without constantly waiting for my turn to speak. I was successful in my career as a software developer, where my tendency to observe carefully and think before speaking was actually valued as a professional strength. I was in a healthy, loving relationship with my girlfriend Charlotte, who told me regularly that she loved how I made her feel heard and understood. But none of that personal success or happiness mattered to my family. To them, quiet automatically meant broken, antisocial, or somehow lacking in essential social skills. The comments and criticism escalated steadily over the years. What had started as gentle teasing about my personality gradually transformed into pointed criticism disguised as loving concern. Kevin would joke loudly that I was turning into a hermit who forgot how to function in public. Melissa would dramatically announce to anyone within earshot that she was seriously worried about Nathan's social development. Patricia would stage whisper to cousins and relatives about how I used to be more fun and outgoing when we were children, as if my childhood personality was the real me and my adult self was some kind of disappointing deviation. My parents enabled and amplified all of this criticism by constantly making excuses for my behavior or trying to force me into conversations in ways that felt humiliating and performative. They'd put me on the spot to share news or opinions during family dinners, then look visibly disappointed when I gave honest, concise answers instead of launching into the kind of animated storytelling performances they seemed to expect from all their children. What really frustrated me was that while they obsessed over my supposed social deficiencies, they seemed completely blind to the actual serious problems unfolding right in front of them at every family gathering. Kevin, the charming golden child everyone adored, had developed a serious gambling addiction that he was hiding by constantly borrowing money from our parents under different creative pretenses. Melissa was clearly struggling with alcoholism, regularly showing up to family events already intoxicated and getting progressively drunker throughout the evening. But she covered it well enough with humor and charm that everyone chose to pretend they didn't notice. Patricia was having an obvious affair that was systematically destroying her marriage, but she deflected attention from her own problems by constantly gossiping about everyone else's personal business and relationships. And then there were my parents themselves, who were dealing with their own serious marital issues. Dad had been carrying on what he thought was a secret emotional affair with a coworker for over a year, exchanging inappropriate texts and meeting for lunches that he actively lied to Mom about. Mom clearly knew something was fundamentally wrong in their relationship, but instead of addressing the real problems directly, she'd become increasingly controlling about family appearances, insisting that everyone attend every single family event and perform happiness and togetherness whether they actually felt it or not. But somehow, mysteriously, my natural quietness was consistently identified as the family's most pressing concern and the behavior most in need of immediate intervention. The breaking point had been building steadily for months leading up to my cousin Derek's wedding. Charlotte and I had gotten engaged 6 months earlier, and the wedding planning process had given my family even more opportunities to offer unsolicited commentary about my personality and social skills. They had strong opinions about everything from our guest list to our choice of venue, and they couldn't seem to understand why I wasn't more visibly excited about being the center of attention at my own wedding celebration. "You really need to work on your social skills before the big day," Melissa had announced during a recent family dinner, her words slightly slurred from the wine she'd been drinking since arriving. "No one wants a groom who looks like he'd rather be literally anywhere else on earth." Patricia had immediately chimed in with her own helpful advice. "Remember, Nathan, it's your job as the groom to make sure everyone has a good time at your reception. You can't just stand there being antisocial and awkward all night while Charlotte does all the work." Even Mom had gotten involved in the coaching sessions, gently suggesting that maybe I should consider taking a public speaking class or practice telling entertaining stories about how Charlotte and I met and fell in love. Because apparently my genuine happiness about marrying the woman I loved wasn't enough, I needed to learn how to perform that joy in a way that met their specific standards for social acceptability. Derek's wedding was held at a beautiful country club, and the reception was exactly the kind of event my family thrives at. Lots of people, lots of noise, lots of opportunities to network and show off their social skills. I was actually looking forward to it because Derek and I had always gotten along well despite our different personalities, and I was genuinely happy for him and his new wife Amy. Charlotte and I arrived on time, found our assigned table, and settled in to enjoy what promised to be a lovely celebration. The ceremony had been beautiful and heartfelt. Derek looked happier than I'd ever seen him, and Amy was absolutely radiant. Their families seemed to genuinely like and respect each other, which felt refreshing compared to some of the more dramatic family weddings I'd attended over the years. For the first hour or so of the reception, everything proceeded normally and pleasantly. I chatted comfortably with cousins I rarely had the chance to see, congratulated Derek and Amy on their beautiful ceremony, and enjoyed watching Charlotte effortlessly charm my extended family with her natural conversation skills and warm personality. I was perfectly content to let her take the lead in most social interactions while I observed and contributed to conversations when I had something meaningful or interesting to add. But as the evening progressed and the alcohol began flowing more freely throughout the reception, the familiar family patterns started emerging with depressing predictability. Kevin made the first pointed comment during the cocktail hour, speaking loud enough for several relatives and family friends to hear his observation. "Look at Nathan over there," he said with theatrical gestures, pointing his beer bottle in my direction. "Still working hard to master the fine art of saying absolutely nothing, I see." A few people laughed awkwardly at his comment, and I tried my best to brush it off as typical Kevin behavior. He'd clearly had a few drinks already and was performing for the cousins who had always found his supposed wit entertaining. But then Melissa decided to join the commentary during dinner. She was sitting at the table directly next to ours, and she kept turning around to make loud observations about my behavior for the benefit of anyone within earshot. "Nathan, are you feeling okay tonight? You haven't said a single word in 20 minutes, she announced dramatically, causing people at multiple nearby tables to turn and look at me with concern. "Charlotte, is he always this antisocial at family events? Or is something wrong?" I could see Charlotte getting genuinely uncomfortable with the sudden unwanted attention, but she handled the situation with her usual grace and diplomacy, explaining calmly that I was perfectly fine and was simply enjoying listening to everyone else's stories rather than feeling compelled to dominate conversations. But Melissa wasn't satisfied with that perfectly reasonable explanation. "That's really sweet of you to defend him like that," she said with a patronizing smile that made my skin crawl. "But Nathan's always been exactly like this. We've been trying to get him to come out of his shell for literally years now." The running commentary about my personality continued relentlessly throughout the entire reception. Patricia made several jokes about how I was obviously practicing for my own wedding by perfecting the fine art of disappearing into the background completely. Dad suggested with a chuckle that maybe I should give an impromptu practice speech since I'd need to actually talk during my own reception in a few months. Mom kept asking repeatedly if I was feeling all right because I seemed even quieter than usual tonight, as if my normal personality was already concerning, but tonight's version was approaching crisis levels. With each passing comment, I felt my frustration and anger building steadily. Here we were at Derek's wedding, supposedly celebrating his happiness and new marriage, and somehow my personality had become a primary topic of discussion for half the family. I was angry about the constant criticism, embarrassed that Charlotte was witnessing this toxic dynamic firsthand, and absolutely fed up with being treated like a problem that needed immediate solving. But what really pushed me toward my breaking point was watching the staggering hypocrisy play out in real time right in front of everyone. While Kevin was making jokes about my supposed lack of social skills, I watched him disappear from the reception 3 separate times to make phone calls that I was absolutely certain were to his bookie. He'd return from each call looking progressively more stressed and agitated, but everyone continued to ignore his obvious anxiety because he was still cracking jokes and buying rounds of drinks for the table. While Melissa was loudly criticizing my quietness, she was working on her 4th large glass of wine despite the fact that she'd driven herself to the wedding. She was getting noticeably louder and more inappropriate with each drink, but everyone laughed along with her increasingly slurred stories instead of expressing any concern about her obvious drinking problem. While Patricia was suggesting that I needed to be more social and engaged, she was texting constantly throughout the dinner service. From my angle, I could clearly see that she wasn't texting her husband, who was sitting right next to her looking miserable and completely ignored. She was obviously communicating with someone she shouldn't have been, but no one called her out for being rude to Derek and Amy by staying glued to her phone during their wedding reception. And my parents? Dad spent half the evening stepping outside to take what he claimed were urgent work calls, but I could tell from his body language and the way he'd smile while talking that these conversations had nothing to do with his job. Mom spent the other half of the evening making passive-aggressive comments to him about his distraction and then redirecting her frustration by intensifying her criticism of my behavior. I was watching my family systematically fall apart in slow motion, and somehow my natural quietness was being treated as the elephant in the room that everyone needed to address. The final breaking point came during the traditional toast portion of the reception. Derek's best man had given a genuinely beautiful speech about friendship, loyalty, and the importance of finding someone who loves you for exactly who you are. Amy's sister had shared a touching story about watching their relationship develop and how obvious it was that they brought out the best in each other. When the microphone was opened up for anyone else who wanted to say something, I knew exactly what would happen next. Kevin grabbed the microphone first, naturally, and launched into a rambling toast that somehow became more about showcasing his supposed comedic talents than celebrating Derek and Amy. He told several stories that were really about his own adventures, with Derek functioning more as a supporting character in Kevin's narratives than as the groom being honored. Melissa followed with what started as a sweet story about Derek's childhood, but quickly devolved into a detailed account of her own dating disasters and relationship philosophy. By the time she finished, most people had forgotten she was supposed to be talking about the happy couple. When Patricia took the microphone, she used the opportunity to make pointed comments about the fundamental importance of honesty and transparency in marriage, while staring directly at her husband with barely concealed hostility. Everyone could feel the tension, but no one acknowledged the obvious subtext of her remarks. Then Mom stood up and approached the microphone, and I could see exactly where this was heading based on the determined look on her face. "I want to say something about the beauty of family," she began, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was about to deliver what she considered profound wisdom. "It's so wonderful to see everyone together tonight, supporting Derek and Amy as they begin this exciting new chapter of their lives. Family gatherings like this remind us how important it is to stay connected and engaged with each other, to share our hearts openly." She paused dramatically and looked directly at me with that familiar expression of loving concern that I learned to dread. Some of us are naturally more outgoing and expressive, and some of us need a little gentle encouragement to share what's truly in our hearts. But that's exactly what family is for, helping each other become the very best versions of ourselves. The implication was absolutely crystal clear. Even at Derek's wedding, celebrating his happiness, she couldn't resist taking a public shot at my personality while disguising it as heartwarming wisdom about family love and support. That's when something fundamental inside me finally snapped. I stood up from my chair, walked deliberately across the reception area to where Mom was standing with the microphone, and gently but firmly took it from her hands. The entire room went quiet, probably because no one in my extended family had ever seen me voluntarily speak in public, let alone interrupt someone else to do it. But I was completely done being quiet about the things that actually mattered. I looked out at the room full of family members and wedding guests, took a deep breath to steady my nerves, and started speaking in a clear, calm voice. "My mom is absolutely right that family gatherings are important," I began, feeling surprisingly confident despite my racing heart. "They give us a rare opportunity to really see each other clearly, to pay attention to what's actually happening instead of just what we want to see or what we're comfortable acknowledging." I could see confusion spreading across my family members' faces. This obviously wasn't the direction they'd expected my first public speaking moment in years to take. For my entire adult life, I've been told repeatedly that I'm too quiet, that I need to speak up more, that my personality is somehow a serious problem that needs immediate fixing. And I've listened to that constant criticism because I love my family and I genuinely wanted to make you happy. My voice was getting stronger and more confident as I continued. But you know what I've learned from being the quiet one all these years? I've learned that sometimes the people who talk the least are actually the ones who see the most clearly. And I see a lot that apparently no one else wants to acknowledge or address. The room was completely silent now. Even the catering staff had stopped moving around and were listening intently. Kevin, I see that you've left this reception 3 separate times to take calls from your bookie, and you're obviously stressed about gambling debts you can't afford to pay because you've been hiding your addiction again. Mom and Dad, I see that you've been quietly covering his losses while lecturing everyone else in the family about financial responsibility. I could see Kevin's face go completely white, but I wasn't finished. Melissa, I see that you drove yourself here tonight despite being drunk enough that you're slurring your words. I see that this isn't remotely the first time this has happened, and I see that everyone's pretending not to notice because it's easier than having a difficult conversation about your drinking. Melissa started to protest, but I kept talking. Patricia, I see that you've spent more time tonight texting someone who isn't your husband than you have actually talking to anyone at this wedding. I see that your marriage is falling apart, but instead of addressing your own problems, you'd rather criticize everyone else's relationships. The tension in the room was becoming almost unbearable, but I wasn't done. And Mom and Dad, I see that you've been so busy managing everyone else's public image that you've completely forgotten to work on your own relationship. Dad, I see that those aren't work calls you keep stepping outside to take. Mom, I see that you know something's fundamentally wrong, but you'd rather control how our family looks from the outside than fix what's actually broken on the inside. I paused and looked around the room at the faces staring back at me. You want to know why I'm quiet at family gatherings? Because I'm watching the people I love destroy themselves and each other while pretending everything is perfectly fine. You want to know why I don't contribute to conversations? Because our conversations are all performance and no substance. I suddenly realized I was hijacking Derek's wedding reception to air years of family grievances, and I felt a wave of regret. Derek and Amy, I'm genuinely sorry this is happening at your wedding. You two actually have something real and honest together, and you deserve to celebrate that without family drama interfering. I handed the microphone directly to Derek and walked back to my table, where Charlotte was looking at me with a mixture of pride, concern, and amazement. The room stayed completely silent for what felt like an eternity. Then Derek, demonstrating exactly why I'd always respected him, managed to gracefully redirect the energy by making a thoughtful comment about how family love is complicated but always worth fighting for. And gradually the reception resumed its normal rhythm. But I knew the damage was done. Or maybe, finally, the healing could actually begin. The aftermath of my speech was immediate, intense, and completely unavoidable. Within hours of Derek's reception ending, my phone was buzzing constantly with calls and texts from various family members. The responses ranged from fury and shock to, surprisingly, genuine gratitude and relief. Kevin was predictably angry, accusing me of deliberately humiliating him in front of our extended family and threatening to cut all contact with me permanently. He claimed I'd completely misunderstood his phone calls and that I had absolutely no right to make assumptions about his personal business, let alone share those assumptions publicly. Melissa was devastated, alternating between angrily denying she had any kind of drinking problem and leaving tearful voicemails apologizing for her behavior while asking how I could do something so cruel and public to my own sister. Patricia was defensive and hurt, insisting that her marriage problems were none of my business and that I'd crossed a serious line by bringing up private matters at a public event. She accused me of using my quiet observer role to essentially spy on family members and then weaponize that information against them. My parents had the most complicated reactions. Mom was deeply hurt and angry, claiming I'd violated the trust that naturally comes with being someone people confide in. She said that being observant didn't give me the right to use what I'd noticed as weapons against the family. Dad, however, surprised me completely. He called me the day after the wedding and asked if we could meet privately for coffee. When we sat down together, he quietly admitted that I'd been absolutely right about his inappropriate relationship with his coworker. He said he'd been planning to end it for months but hadn't known how to address the damage it had already done to his marriage with Mom. But the most unexpected response came from Derek himself. He called me 2 days after his wedding, and I was prepared to offer a lengthy apology for disrupting his reception. Instead, he thanked me. I've been watching our family pretend everything is perfectly fine for years, he told me earnestly. Amy and I have actually been talking about whether we even want to have children because we don't want to raise them in this kind of environment where everyone has to constantly perform instead of just being real and honest with each other. He explained that my speech had been jarring and uncomfortable, but also necessary. Several cousins had approached him afterward to say they'd been thinking similar things about our family dynamics for years, but hadn't known how to address the problems or even whether it was their place to try. The most significant immediate change was in my parents' relationship. Within a week of the wedding, Dad had completely ended his emotional affair and asked Mom to go to couples therapy with him. Mom agreed, but only if the entire family would consider participating in some kind of group counseling to address the broader issues I'd raised so publicly. Over the following weeks, the family began having conversations we'd never had before. Kevin eventually admitted his gambling had spiraled completely out of control and asked my parents to stop covering his debts so he could face real consequences. Melissa got a DUI 3 weeks after the wedding and could no longer deny her drinking problem. Patricia and her husband decided to either rebuild their marriage honestly or end it with dignity instead of continuing to live in dysfunction. It's been 3 months since Derek's wedding now, and I'm still processing everything that's changed in my family and in myself. The most surprising discovery has been that I'm not actually as quiet as everyone always thought. I was just being selective about when and where I used my voice. When I'm in environments where honesty is valued over performance, where listening is appreciated rather than criticized, I actually have quite a lot to say. I've started speaking up more at work, contributing ideas that have led to significant improvements in our team's processes. I've been more vocal in my relationship with Charlotte, sharing thoughts and feelings that I used to keep private. But I've also learned to genuinely value the observational skills that my family used to constantly criticize. Being able to see patterns and dynamics that others miss is actually a significant strength, not a character defect. The problem was never my quietness, it was being in an environment where surface-level noise was valued more than thoughtful observation. My relationship with my family is still complicated and sometimes tense, but it's becoming more honest than it's ever been. We're all slowly learning to distinguish between healthy family loyalty and enabling genuinely destructive behavior. Looking back, I realized that my speech wasn't really about defending my quietness. It was about demanding honesty in a family that had been built on pretense and performance. I'd spent years being criticized for not contributing enough to conversations that were ultimately meaningless because no one was saying what they actually meant. I've learned that there's a crucial difference between being quiet because you have nothing valuable to say and being quiet because you're waiting for a conversation worth having. I've also learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is refuse to participate in their dysfunction, even if that means causing temporary pain. The experience has taught me to trust my own perceptions and to speak up when something truly important is at stake. I'm still naturally more of a listener than a talker, but I'm no longer willing to stay silent when that silence enables harm to the people I love. What do you think? Was I right to call out my family's problems so publicly, or should I have found a way to address these issues privately? Sometimes I wonder if there was a gentler approach that could have forced these necessary conversations, but then I remember how many years of gentle hints and private concerns had been completely ignored. Maybe some truths can only be heard when they're spoken loudly enough to cut through all the noise.